Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. We are back. I apologize for the long delay. In this episode, I'm going to talk about one of my excuses of why we haven't put out the episode in a very long time. So I have a very special guest. In fact, she's my favorite guest that we've ever had on the show, and that is my wife, Sarah Bennett. So I'll just disclose she's a little nervous because she doesn't do many interviews, but
no interviews.
No interviews. This is her first ever. So Sarah and I have just published, and this is my excuse for being a little laxed on the podcast, Trauma Sensitive Early Education, helping preschool and elementary students thrive. So this has been a passion project of ours for about 2 years now. And so I'm happy to say, and hopefully Sarah would agree with me, that we are still happily married after writing this book together, and are really excited to get it out to the world. So I have the honor of just talking with Sarah about the book and to kind of talking a little bit about our process and sort of why we decided to write it and some of sort of the highlights that came out of it for each of us. So I'll kind of start because I think I was the one that threw the idea out first. And this all happened. We were going to Sarah's birthday. I surprised her with a trip to Santa Cruz, California, which is where she was born. And we were waiting for the flight, maybe having a celebratory drink, and start talking about this because one of the things we do with my focus on trauma and Sarah being a first grade teacher is pretty much every day after work we would talk about kids, both the kids doing really well but also sometimes struggling. And so a lot of times our conversations turn back to trauma. And so we were just kind of talking. I had just published my second book talking about trauma and change. And we were kind of kicking around what the next project would be. And we decided, for better or worse, at the airport to write together. So, Sarah, my first question is really just kind of, as we've had these conversations now I think we've been married for 12 years, and together for about 16 and more. As we've kind of talked about this and I've learned more about trauma, I just kind of wanted to just kind of ask the general question is how's our kind of conversations about trauma kind of influence how you look at your students and your work as a teacher?
So I've been teaching for 18 years now, and there's always kids that have academic struggles or they have self-regulation struggles. And we use our bag of tricks, everything we know how to do to try and support those kids. But what I was finding is we weren't necessarily making the growth or progress that I would hope in any of the areas. And so what it came down to is I realized, these kids have traumatic histories oftentimes, and we're not addressing their mental health needs in the elementary school setting. And so we would have these conversations about what are ways I could better support them in my classroom, knowing that these aren't bad kids. These are kids who have traumatic histories that they're trying to work through, and that there is hope that they can make the growth that they need to. So
absolutely. And I think that, our experience recently has been a little different, though I know I'd sort of like to give our audience a little bit of your history, because right now, I think our conversations are interesting because a lot of times I work with kids kind of struggling maybe with homelessness and a lot of social economic problems. But one of the things that I really learned about is as you kind of transitioned into teaching at a highly resourced school district is that I think one of the realizations we both have is just because you might be financially well off doesn't necessarily mean that trauma doesn't exist. And so that was one of my real realizations is, just because, again, kids might not be struggling financially, that there is still a lot of trauma each and every year that goes on at your school as well. But I'd love to just give folks a little bit of background because even though now you're teaching at more a high resource school, you've got an interesting history. So I just love to share a little bit about your teaching experience. Kind of starting, I know we worked together at a school for dually diagnosed developmentally disabled children with extreme behaviors and extreme trauma, but besides that, I think your history is interesting as well. So tell folks just a little bit about your experience both in the United States and beyond.
Okay. So the first place I ever taught was in Turkmenistan as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was assigned as a health education teacher. But what was fascinating about it is I was in a country where you couldn't disclose that the country itself really had issues, and so you would have to approach things like, your neighbors in Uzbekistan have this problem with tuberculosis. So I'm going to teach you about it in case you ever visit. and that might be something you're exposed to. And so my first kind of teaching experiences were interesting in that I was in a foreign country and I was teaching about things that were really, really important to the health of the community. But I couldn't say that it was an issue that they had themselves because it wasn't acknowledged and it wasn't acceptable to say that they had any of these issues. So that was my first teaching experience. And then I went from there, and if you had been in the Peace Corps, there was an opportunity to get a fellowship to teach in New York City and go to Columbia Teachers College. And so that was the next experience of mine. And I was placed in a school in Harlem, and I taught there for 2 years as a pull-out English language acquisition teacher. And that had its own set of learning for me because I was in a neighborhood and a community where there were so many things. These kids did not have the resources. They didn't have, the early childhood education experiences to set them up for success in elementary school. There were so many things that really did sort of hinder their academic growth, but also their ability to access anything in terms of their emotional regulation. And so that was really eye-opening for me in terms of I need to change how I'm teaching and my approaches and how I need to meet these children where they're at. And I need to understand that they may be going home to a home where there is not a pencil. There are no resources. There isn't an adult there who can provide them safety, security, love, even food at times. And so that was a really good experience in the sense that it showed me, the needs that we have in our education system. But also it gave me a lot of hope for the direction. And if we can recognize what we need to do to help, we can really help overcome a lot of these early struggles that these kids have.
Absolutely. And so, with our kind of shared experience in a vast different areas, I haven't been to Turkmenistan. After hearing Sarah's story, it's not high on my list of places to go in particular. I don't think I would do good in an authoritarian government setting. Probably would not be allowed to do this podcast. But, it just really shared as Sarah was having those experiences. I was doing a lot of education in both juvenile justice and child welfare. And we would see these kids sort of at different pieces of their journey. And I think that, at least I think for our conversations, learning about the adverse childhood experience, the ACE study, and childhood trauma really helped us understand why kids were struggling so much. And I think we talk about this a lot in the book of really getting away from the bad kid perspective. And I don't think any probably educator would use those words intentionally now, but I think we still both see that is a lot of these kids from a very early age get these labels, which is why I think our focus hopefully on really early education in preschool, hopefully we can prevent that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy to be put on at such an early age.
Right. And I love that phrase that people say of not what is wrong with this child, but what happened to this child. And I think for a lot of educators, we haven't even begun to delve into the what happened to them because we are inundated with test scores and assessments and getting them to these other places that the what happened to them to create who this current little being is doesn't get addressed.
Yeah, Absolutely. And my hope in doing this and really taking this on as a focus is with my work in homelessness and HIV and sort of the adult system, mental health arenas, every time I talk to people experiencing homelessness or most people struggling with an addiction, and they share their ACE score with me or their past trauma, I really realize, and I realized this early on, but I wanted to do something about it, is these were once kids that we didn't know were in pain and were struggling. We thought they were, and it just blows my mind to say this, but I was one of these people. We thought they'd come to school and choose to behave badly. Like there was a choice that a kindergartner was making to misbehave. And if we just found like the right punishment or the right reward or the right star or light system, and I was so guilty of all these behavioral approaches, that we would figure the kid out and find that kid's motivation. And I think with the paradigm shift of saying, no, this kid is really hurting. This kid is in pain, and they're just don't have the skills yet to really succeed. It takes it away from being the kid making bad choices to a kid needing skill development and also maybe mental health support as well moving forward.
Well, and one of my big takeaways from the book was that you can have two siblings within the same family who've experienced similar trauma in their history, and they might have completely different reactions to that trauma. So you might have this child's older sibling and think, well, they were fine, they were functioning fine, they were able to control their body, and they were able to learn and access their learning. And then you get the younger sibling and they're really struggling. And I think it was a really big aha moment for me when I realized every child is going to process trauma differently. And just because the same experience happened to two children, their reactions to those experiences could be vastly different, which means our approaches as educators also have to be vastly different depending on the child.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I'd love to get sort of your thoughts on, because I think writing the book made me really, and I've done a lot of work with districts around the country. I'm in my 5th or 6th years working with Cleveland school districts. I've done a lot of work out in Pasadena, a lot of work here in Colorado as well. And one of the things I think when you write a book, at least my experience is even when I talk about something, I can sort of be a little bit vague about it. When you write a book, you've got to be concrete, and you're really good at being concrete. I'm good at being vague and big picture. And boy, Sarah made me, well, how's this work in the classroom? Over and over and over. How's this work in the classroom? And one of the things that as I really thought concretely about the school structure. And I kind of see this not only in your district, but other districts I work with, is just right now the lack of mental health support. And I think, I'll give your district credit. I think they're looking at this with the social emotional learning. I know there's a good mental health person that we both worked with in a past situation. Jamie, if you're listening, just a shout out. We love you. But as we thought about this from, okay, what do these kids need? And one of our answers, and a big part of the book, is how do we structure classrooms around this? I also for me, the thinking about mental health support in schools is just how lacking we are right now. And hey, a teacher identifies this child, maybe the parent doesn't have the resources or even, maybe the motivation or the ability to get them connected into community services. So how do we start to think about schools as a place for healing and support? And to me, that was one of the big challenges of where we're at now, and where trauma-sensitive schools hopefully will take us. And love to hear kind of your experiences. We thought through that kind of structurally about the mental health support as part of student success.
Right. There's a couple things that I think are really, really important in this. So often in education, a child is having a quote unquote bad day, or, there's some kind of incident that occurs. Well, then there's support. After the incident, there's processing around the incident. Maybe they'll get to see a counselor or someone temporarily to discuss that specific incident. But rarely is it addressed of this child has a history of trauma. We don't know what their triggers are, but if we could get to what are the triggers to prevent some of these incidents from happening in the first place. So often we don't have any of that ability to address those things ahead of time. to do preventative as opposed to reactionary. And I think in terms of mental health, I'm so fortunate. I'm in a district that has a lot of resources. And even with that, we don't have a full-time psychologist. We don't have, we just recently have a full-time counselor, but it's taken years to even get that. And I think of all the districts that don't have the resources that mine does and how those services are so hard to come by. Additionally to that, though, when you think about trauma, things like speech language services are crucial. That's one of the first things that you need to refer a child to, because oftentimes that part of the brain will be underdeveloped, and so they're not able to communicate or even process information being given to them at the same level, developmental level, as their peers based on their past trauma. And if your school doesn't have a speech language pathologist, how do you address that? And those are the kinds of things that we talked about.
Yeah. And I would also throw, from my experience, especially with special education, is the occupational therapy as well. I think, to have OT, I kind of, it was a little bit of a joke, but it was very serious when we worked in the special education school. Even though I had the mental health background and I was supposed to be running the school, I often referred to myself as an occupational therapist tech, because I really understood if we didn't meet the sensory motor needs, if we didn't have find out ways for kids to self-soothe and to self-regulate, that's when we saw the behavioral issues come out. And that was a whole different way for me, trained as a mental health therapist, to really see the behavior. So when you start to think about trauma-sensitive schools, one of the things is to get all the teachers, the principals, the nurses, everybody educated on this. But it also, shows is, hey, we need to be here. If we're really going to give every kid the ability to reach their potential, we've got to really look at our schools in a very, very different way. And it just really shows, again, and not in any ways to show your school, but I just think schools are so under-resourced if we really want to help kids with trauma in a really holistic perspective as well.
Right.
And obviously, getting this into the classroom is key, because often the teachers are on the front line of that piece too. The other thing that I really have been thinking about a lot, and this really came out in the book, is that if we're going to take this trauma-sensitive school movement seriously, there's another big challenge there. One is to have the mental health and other therapies available within the school system. And those can be like from outside community partners as well. It's not like you have to have all these resources that are in the school district proper, but partnering with community-based organizations to connect people to resources. But the other question, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is the families as well. Because sometimes even if we can say, oh, what happened to this kid, I think it's really easy for us, and I've been guilty of this as well, is, oh, they're from that family. Or if you met that family, you know why this kid was screwed up. And again, we might use better language, but that's kind of what's coming across. So I think one of the big challenges that I got writing was, we need to look at the family and how do we support the family, because if the kid's got to go home to a dysfunctional or even dangerous home environment every night, we may make a couple steps forward during the school day, but psychologically they're going to have to go home and just basically survive. So much of that work gets pushed back. And one of my challenges is not only what happened to this kid, but what happened to these parents along the way as well. Are they dealing with their own resolved trauma moving forward? So looking at parents and families of how we can support them as well, I think is another big step, but a very different way to think from a school perspective.
When we were researching for the book, this term two-generational support came up, and it really makes sense, because so often in the classroom, teachers will say, oh, I'm giving everything to this child, and within the school day, and then they go home and it just all backslides, because all the behaviors and things get reinforced at home, and then we have to start over again the next day. And it's because we aren't offering support to the families that can trickle down to the child. And when you just try to address it for the child, you're ignoring the entire home environment, which we can't do. We can't afford to continue to ignore the home environments any longer.
Yep. And this is where, yeah, there's a huge challenge for schools here, but there's also for all the community providers out there who may get funding for mental health supports and other variety of resources, especially we think about the little kiddos in the preschool settings. I know there's a lot of resources in early childhood out there is how do we approach schools and create partnerships, because schools are waking up to this, but they're starting at the paradigm, just with really in the last few years. I give a shout out to the folks. We weren't able to make it because parent-teacher conferences got scheduled at the wrong time, but the Trauma Sensitive School Conference, I believe, is in DC again this year, and we were wanting to make it, but just weren't able to schedule-wise. But it's the third annual conference, so it kind of shows where we're at thinking about this as schools. But so for the social service agencies out there, mental health agencies, is how can you partner with your schools and maybe help with the training aspect of this, the knowledge acquisition, but also creating that robust resources and safety net for our families as well. Because again, a lot of those parents are struggling. Some of those were kids that we didn't reach because we didn't know why they had their own struggles as well.
Right. And I can say too, as a teacher, one of the things that we often say is, we plan these great lessons. We're trained in our teacher preparatory programs, to have these beautiful lesson plans and these assessments and follow-ups and differentiation and all these things. But what isn't addressed is it's an assumption that you'll have the behavior management piece under control so that you can implement those beautiful lessons. And I think that's an area where we need to improve in education, is when teachers are being trained to go into the classroom, and once they're in, we need continued professional development on best practices and strategies to get emotional regulation into our classrooms. Because without an emotionally regulated child, their ability to listen and comprehend and digest and process what they're learning is limited.
Absolutely. So the other piece that really stuck out with me in writing this, because if you've never written a book before, you do a lot of research because you got to back it up. And so if you've heard me talk, you know how I value self-care, and I see self-care as one of the biggest determinants of whether or not we're able to provide quality education, quality services to those we've dedicated our professional lives to serving. And a couple statistics really, I don't know if they surprise me being married to an educator and being in schools myself, is one of the things is, especially for early educators, doctors were number one as far as determined burnout, nurses 2, social workers number 3, teachers 4, principals 5. And so I want to bring this to life because sometimes we just say burnout and it's like, yeah, we're all burned out. But I always like to give the examples that if we packed a stadium full of professionals in your city and we wanted to bring up the most mentally ill people just based on the work that they do, so that's all we knew about them, we would bring the healers up first, right? The physicians, the nurses, which is scary in and of its own right. Social workers, big call out for a lot of us. Mental health folks, we're not much better off. We're in the top 10 as well. But then, number 4 and 5 on that list would be the educators. Especially you see a little bit more higher ratings of burnout for elementary and preschool educators than middle and high school, but also early education principals as well. So, just really when you start to look at the number of educators each year leaving the profession altogether, who just say, I'm done with education, and just leave altogether, or just give up on a school or a system, it's just appalling. And so, one of the pieces as you look at kind of the second, or maybe the kind of the third sort of the book, and when we start to get into teacher health and wellness, I think one of the biggest struggles to create trauma-sensitive schools is to take self-care and look at it in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
And not that you're ever burned out, my dear, but never burned out. But I just kind of want to, as you wrote this with me,
Mm-hmm.
you know, having gone through, and if anybody knows my wife, they know she's an amazing teacher. And whether you meet her in August or May in her classroom, she's got different energy. Now, she might have different energy when she comes home. The joke is she's usually asleep on the couch by 4:30. But I just kind of wonder, as you looked at that,
Mm-hmm.
and being now in teaching for a decade and a half, just kind of how was that for you to kind of sit with that aspect of the trauma sensitive school movement?
You know, sadly, it's not a surprise to me that teachers and elementary school principals rank highly on these burnout charts, because you know it seems like things are constantly in flux and changing, and so there's new standards and new things to address, and it kind of seems like our plates are getting more and more full as we go, and so we're sort of dog paddling and trying to keep up. And so when you think about like our own self-care, well, that has to go on the back burner because we have 100 new things to learn and all these things to implement. And our school day, you know, we're teaching every subject within the school day, and we have to prep for all those subjects. And you know, we're lucky if we can use the restroom. So it didn't surprise me. And I think we all tell ourselves, you know, when you meet the teachers in August, it's the energy is high and we're raring to go, and everyone has these grand plans for how they're going to work out, and they're going to, you know, be more mindful, and they're going to take care of themselves. And then slowly, as teacher conferences come and report cards come and all these additional responsibilities happen, our self-care sort of goes out the window. And I think in the book, something we address is how there's no one really holding us accountable to our self-care beyond ourselves. Mm-hmm. And if there was someone else in the building who would check in with you about that, so how's your self-care going? What are you doing to make sure that you can get through conferences and not get sick like you always do after every conference cycle?
Every conference cycle.
Yeah, that's me. I do that. Yeah. But just how valuable that would be, because you get lost in it, and self-care is really hard to consider because as a teacher, your mind is on your kids and their needs and what they need from day to day, minute to minute, and naturally what comes last is you. We talked a lot about that.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's a challenge to both the system and the individual, because I think, you know, and I'll talk to the social worker, mental health folks, and the medical professionals out there as well who also dominate those categories, is I think we get so good and so focused on others. And I think the real challenge that I like to give people is, if you don't take care of yourself, you're not giving your best self to others. And even if you don't, some of the most interesting research in burnout is you might not realize you're burnout, but they can now measure your quality dropping as well. So it's this thing about, okay, if we do value the services or the care we're giving other folks, we've really got to figure out ways, both systematically, because if you're in the top, you know, 5, and you can put EMTs in, like, I believe there were 6, police, then mental health folks. So you see these people in these very emotionally intense, just being destroyed by the work they do. We've got to rethink it from a systems perspective, but we also have to, as I challenge people, is like, there's nothing wrong with taking a bubble bath on a Wednesday, but that's not necessarily self-care, right? Like, what is your plan ahead of time? And for educators, what's your plan in June or July? Because you don't want to make the plan in April, right? When you're barely dog paddling and treading water to stay above. So really, both that individual responsibility, which I understand is difficult as somebody who's been burned out as a mental health professional and an educator, but also how do we rethink education? Because if you look at the numbers, not just of burnout, but people leaving the field, something's very broken in education as well. And so big challenge, I think, there too.
Absolutely.
The other thing that you taught me, you know, around this, and we I had to rewrite this section of the book, is I was thinking about that systematic perspective. And one of the things that I knew existed, but I think Sarah did a great job of really helping me think it is the idea potentially when a school takes on to become a trauma sensitive school, the role of coaches in that. And I loved your thinking around both supporting trauma-sensitive lesson planning, how to work specifically with kids that behaviors and academic struggles might be coming out of their traumatic situation. But the other thing I loved about how you looked at it is coaches are often really well positioned to help teachers with their own wellness and self-care as well. So the even while supervision in mental health and social work I learned is very different than supervision in schools, I did love how at the end of the book when we figured out how to bring this together that the coaching model was something that really I think became a central part in this journey as well.
What we talked about mostly was, Matt had mentioned, if your supervisor could be your resource, your go-to for you when you're feeling, on the verge of burnout and you're feeling like you are not able to handle different situations and you need someone to bounce ideas off of, go to your supervisor. And I had said, when someone is in an evaluatory role, if they determine what your whether or not you have a job, at the end of it, that makes it difficult for you to be vulnerable and to really be honest about maybe challenges you're having in your classroom or challenges you might be having personally. And so we came to this conclusion that it would really need to be someone who's more of a coach in a building, and that coach could be that go-to resource. And just like we say for kids how important it is for them to develop a relationship with the adult they're working with, if you had a trauma-sensitive coach in your building, they could develop that relationship with the child, but they could also develop that relationship with the educator. And, and if you know each other well enough, you can see when things are challenging for someone, and that allows for someone to step in and support. And now, so often, we don't have those people in our building, so we're able to identify when there's a crisis in a classroom and go in and support the teacher and the children that need it. And how beautiful that would be if schools could provide that.
Absolutely. And that sort of brings me to a big thank you is for those listeners of the show, Jerry Yeager will be a name you're familiar with. So Jerry and his wife, Lauren, who has been a coach in a Jefferson County School District, which is just west of Denver here. And, it would be fun to see in their careers between Jerry and Lauren, who's impacted more lives in a positive way. You talk about a power couple who's been amazing role models for us. We just got to celebrate that we had them as part of this book over the weekend. But, it was kind of funny because you have Jerry and I sitting there from our mental health perspective, and we're like, of course the supervisor can be this. And I already lost this battle. So Jerry was all by himself. And it was funny because, how your spouse can sometimes roll their eyes at you. And just to watch Lauren do to Jerry what Sarah did to me. But it's, this is part of the challenge is how do we be creative with this? And if we're really going to integrate really this whole different way to think about kids in our classrooms, in our schools, and supporting teachers in a different way, these might be really good investments in doing so.
Well, and I'd like to add that in terms of the teacher too, so often experiences that teachers go through are not really even considered like when there's placement of children. So for example, if I had a parent pass away, I'm going to be triggered emotionally, I'm going to be sad, thinking about that. If you have a child who's placed into your class and they're in the process of losing a parent, that combination might not be the best combination. And so often we look at just where the kids are at, but we don't consider where the teacher is and whether those are going to be experiences that would be positive or perhaps negative for both parties.
Yep.
And I think that's something that also needs to be considered.
Yep. And again, the investment in teacher health will pay off in test scores and everything else that we're trying to measure in education as well. One of my favorite things to kind of think about and write in this book was the conclusion. And the conclusion, I gave myself and Sarah the magic wand. And it's like, okay, if we were just to create the trauma-sensitive school, and I think in the book it said a billionaire just writes you a blank check, and you could do whatever you want. I think a few of our conclusions we try to be somewhat realistic with it, but some of the conclusions we've already mentioned. I think more of the support as far as the different therapies in our dream school. We'd also not just making sure the music's there, but also really looking at therapeutic physical education, such as trauma sensitive yoga, as well as getting kids to run and be active every day in more structured activities. Again, they need unstructured playtime too, but I think it's something for the kids I know I've worked with is they need to run each and every day and have that kind of structure. Music therapy being a part of this, art therapy. So, I call them, I think in the book, specials. Like, yeah, we want the art and music to stay, but we could also really help kids and create healing experiences for them as well. The other thing that and I put a lot of thought in this because I always get this piece of feedback in my trainings is, I'll teach educators on the impact of trauma and why we see a lot of these behaviors. And I'll always have teachers, and I have so much empathy for this, is they'll come up and say, Matt, this is really helpful because now I understand a lot of these behaviors, but there's one of me. I've got 5 kids that I know are struggling with severe trauma. They're throwing chairs, yelling at each other, and there's one of me for 25, 26 kids. I've got 5 kids who are re-traumatized and triggered most of the day. How do I handle them and teach all the other kids at the same time? And I wish I had a great answer to that, but I don't. I mean, and so one of the things that as I dream about what a trauma-sensitive school would do, and do it in a little bit of a realistic way, because I don't think, if we said, it'd be great to have 1 teacher per every 10 kids, obviously that would be ideal, but not practical, is, thinking about and do communities value their children enough to really invest in para support? And we talk in the book, I don't like paraprofessionals as a word. Teachers' assistants or educational specialists, I think, are much better, but how do we bring that level of support in? So, I've watched you, I think it was one year, a couple years ago, where you did have a full-time support in the classroom, and it just allowed you to teach in a whole different way. And I think about, okay, teachers can get pretty expensive, though we all want teachers to get paid more. But at the same time, it's like, how do we support them with that paraprofessional, where we know with trauma, one of the big things to help these kiddos is relationships. And again, if you're 1 to 26 ratio, you're not going to have necessarily the time to relationally manage these kids while doing your job of teaching the other kids. And so that was one of the lessons I think I've learned from you, especially that 1 or 2 years in your career where you've had that additional support, and especially when you really created a great team with that para, and how that changed the way you're able to teach as well.
It really did. All teachers carry a little sense of guilt with them, because if you are doing behavior management most of the day, then you're like, well, what about my kids who are ready to learn, and my kids who are, ready to move on with content, but I can't move on because I'm dealing with dysregulated kids most of my day, and it does make a difference. And another adult in the room can make all the difference. If a child just needs to go for a walk or go visit a sensory room or those types of things, you can't leave your kids unattended, and you can't do that. And so if there's one thing that we wish, if that blank check was written, it would be that every classroom has at least 2 adults in it to help with everything. And not just 2 adults, but 2 adults who are trained in trauma sensitive approaches, and that they understand, the child behind the behavior, and that it's not about a child choosing to misbehave.
Absolutely. And so I want to thank Sarah for being a great guest, favorite guest ever on the show.
Thanks.
It's great to be back. By the way, again, I apologize for the long break. I'll get Jerry and Kurt back on here eventually, I promise. They're all living life. Jerry's golfing. We heard, we'll see if Jerry actually listens to the podcast, but we got a great story about Jerry Goffin in Mexico and throwing a club into the jungle. So you know, you have a beer or two with Jerry, you learn some good stories. So again, the book is Trauma Sensitive Early Education. One of the reasons, you know, besides our shared passion for education and how we see it really help these kiddos, is that we hope if you're not in education, but you might be passionate about trauma-informed care and social work, mental health, that, hey, you know, for a few bucks, you could take this to your community school, elementary school, preschool. If you've got a kid in a school system, that you could maybe hand this off to a principal, or maybe even a school board member to really spread the word. We know that there's some books coming out, and we just saw that elementary preschool level. Not that, you know, as I say, if you can catch a kid anytime during their educational years, we can really have a great post-traumatic growth experience for them. But there is something very valuable if we can catch the trauma early on and surround that family with support and surround that kid with love. Boy, and they don't have to carry this pain and suffering into even middle school with them, much less that I see into adulthood. We can really start to make a huge difference in our community. So we hope our contribution can help with that. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Sarah. She was really nervous, but I think she did a great job. So I want to thank you, and thanks everybody, and I will see you soon.
Thanks.